we're going to be talking a lot about dreams. And I'm going to bring in a bunch of Freud because Freud is fascinating, but we'll also talk about that issue of why Freud can be simultaneously fascinating and yet not respected by scientists. So we'll talk a little bit about that story, and then we'll come in to talk more about dreams from a scientific perspective, what we know about them, why they're such an interesting and challenging topic to study. So let me kind of start there, actually. There are a couple of topics in psychology that I think really show the daring of psychologists to some extent. And that's consciousness, and we're going to have a whole chapter. You're getting into that chapter now about consciousness. That's as close as any science comes to studying the soul, right? This concept of a soul. Our consciousness, our sense of self, our sense of self-awareness. There's a lot of... Okay, so, let's just kind of start here. Dreams they've been a source of fascination for human beings for a long time. They are, to some extent, from many ancient civilizations, seen as a sort of in-between world between the reality that we normally experience and, well, something like that spirit world or some spirit plane. So we see in a lot of traditions that dreams are given some mystical and spiritual special value. They are sometimes seen as providing premonitions for the future or guidance, or sometimes they're linked to creativity, that people solve problems in their dreams. So they seem like these really fascinating thing that we don't understand very well, very mysterious, and therefore very interesting. So let's just sort of start here and say, I like to start here because it's an interesting question. How often do you think you dream? So I'm going to start this question, and you'll see these choices. Now this will also show up on your app or whatever. You can pick from these choices as you go. You'll see there's a big number in the denominator there. That'll change, but that's because there are people watching online as well. So there are now, I guess, 159 people signed in to the app, and I will let the questions go for a while. You'll also notice it won't start right from zero every time. There's some leftovers from yesterday. I like to just have them pool together so we get a bigger data set. For any of these, I'll wait for a little while you do things, but I won't wait too long. So if you really want your answer to be recorded, try not to wait too long to vote because I will jump in like this and get it rolling. Okay, so let's see the responses. So really, in reality, the real answer is A. And the real answer is not just A, but it's A several times, probably 4 or 5 times. You probably have 4 or 5 or 6 episodes of dreaming every night. But it doesn't feel like that. In fact, we have some people that say, I don't have dreams. Not many, 5 in this class, but there's some people who feel like they never dream. I think you know a little bit about the story of this now. It's all about when you wake up from your dream cycle. And if you wake up right from a dream, which is very common, especially if you sleep in, you've slept a long night, it's very common to wake up from a dream, then you tend to have that dream in your mind when you wake up. But if you wake up at any other time, for example, if it's an alarm clock that wakes you up, there's a good chance that alarm clock does not kick in while you're dreaming. You may be in a deep sleep or some other, we'll talk about those cycles of sleep again. And in that case, you won't feel like you have had a dream at all. And so for some people, they tend to always wake up at times when they're not dreaming. Often these people didn't go to bed early enough. They're waking up early to an alarm, and their brain is trying to get deep sleep to recover from some of the sleep they're missing. And so they don't dream very much. Okay? But in reality, we all dream every night. And if somebody were to hang around with you and watch you while you were sleeping, which I know sounds really creepy, but if they were, they would see that about every 45 minutes, your eyes would start to move under your eyelids. And that's corresponding to you in a dream state. And if they woke you up at that period of time, you would report a dream. You would say, oh, yeah, I was having this dream. And so we can confirm that everybody is dreaming in that way. I don't think there's anybody alive that doesn't dream. I'll tell you why I don't think that in a moment. I don't think you can survive without dreaming, which is kind of interesting. We will get there. But let's start here. Why Freud? Well, again, it's a fun thing to lecture about. Everybody likes Freud stories. Freud is an interesting character. Let's start right from the beginning. Well, and the other reason I'm doing Freud now is because Freud really brought dreams to psychology. But he brought them not from a scientific perspective. And so it's always important to me to make the following point before we start talking about Freud. We always end our discussions of Freud as saying, and that's why scientists don't value his contribution, which sounds really sort of negative or nasty. But the important point at the beginning is Freud wasn't a scientist. Freud wasn't trying to impress scientists. That was not his game. I don't know if Freud cared what scientists thought about him. Freud was a medical doctor. That was his training, and his technique was medical in style as well. And so he ultimately applied the medical model to the mind. And the medical model goes like this. You come to a doctor because you have some symptoms. Sniffly nose, maybe a dry throat, maybe whatever. And the doctor wants to hear your symptoms. But he's not really that impressed with the symptoms. He thinks those symptoms, if he studies them well enough, will give him a sense, or her a sense, of the underlying cause, the virus or the infection, or what is it that's really giving rise to these symptoms. So the symptoms are seen as the reflection of a deeper problem. And they are a way to get at that deeper problem, to understand what that deeper problem is, and then you treat the deeper problem. Freud took that logic and applied it to what we now call mental illness. That a lot of people were coming with issues that seem to have no physiological cause. Something where a normal doctor could not find any reason for these issues. And Freud said, well, it's a psychological reason then. But the same notion that there's something happening deep inside this individual at a deep psychological level, and that thing is giving rise to the symptoms. So for example, let's say somebody came in a psychoanalytic kind of situation and said, Dr. Freud, every time I get into a relationship, I really want to be in a relationship really bad, but every time I get into a relationship and things start going well, I completely screw it up. I just mess things up totally. I blow up the relationship every time. I've done this over and over again. And Freud would say, oh yes, that's because there's something going on deep inside of you that even you are not aware of. So this is a big part of Freud. So let's do a little bit, let's take a step deeper. This will all connect to dreams in just a moment, as you'll see. So Freud was big on this thinking that our personality or drives came from sort of three sources. The id, translated from German to the it, and by the it means like the primitive you, a very selfish part of us that wants what we want and wants it now. So a very kind of caveman version of ourselves, let's say, that has desires and that would like those desires satisfied immediately, please. But then let's jump to the superego. The superego was a part of our mind that learned the kinds of things society likes and values in people and wants to live up to those things. We want society to see us as a person of value, a person of goodness, a person that somehow is adding positivity to the world. We want them to see us with respect and admiration, if possible, and all of that is sort of in the superego. And these two clash, right? And so the example I like to give with that is, if I'm in front of you right now and I'm saying, you know, I have this need, I have some primitive needs. Those primitive needs cover the full spectrum. So for example, I need a certain amount of warmth, okay? If I don't have that warmth, well, I can go over and throw on my hoodie over there, right in front of you. I could go put on my hoodie, come back, throw on my hoodie, zip it up, continue talking. Wouldn't be a problem at all, right? You guys would be perfectly fine with me satisfying my biological need for warmth in a public, open way like this. Similarly, if I was thirsty, I can easily go over, have a drink of my coffee. No shock, no outrage, no problems. There were two drives that Freud said were different: sex and aggression. If I have some sexual desire right now in front of you guys, I better not do anything about it, right? If I have some aggressive desire, you know, if I want to go over and pop Lauren in the nose for some reason, she's annoyed me, I'm gonna go take her on. If I do that, I expect shock and outrage, right? I expect you guys to say, what the heck are you guys doing? You don't do that, and that goes against that superego, right? You would think I was a jerk. You would think I was an idiot that couldn't control myself in certain ways. And so if I let that part of my primitive self act out and behave the way it wants, then I'm going to run into challenges from society. And so we have to find a balance between that primitive part of ourselves and that self we would like everyone to see us as, and that's where the ego comes in. So for Freud, the ego was sort of the referee. The ego was the one that sort of found ways where people could satisfy some impulses, maybe not exactly as they would like to, but they could be redirected in ways that would release the psychic energy, Freud would say. So let's say there was an individual who was very obsessed with the female form, the curves of the female form, and would love to, pass their hands along the female form as often as they could. That person might grow up to be someone who creates guitars. And guitars have all these smooth corners and edges, right? And so you can enjoy the sensual pleasure of feeling curves and handling curves if those curves are a guitar. And so you could really take great pleasure in forming beautiful guitars and enjoying that shape. And so that would be a redirection of that id energy into something that society sees as valuable. You could become a really great guitar builder. And nobody would think there's anything wrong with that. You could even go a little closer and maybe become a great artist of nude models. You're not putting your hands on the female form there, but that's another example of how you could take your enjoyment of the female form and express it in a way that society would appreciate and potentially value. And so this was sort of the game with Freud to a large extent, that we learned to kind of balance these things and find these things outlets. But here's the important thing we need to talk about in this form now. Well, two things. Let's just highlight a couple of these things. First of all, according to Freud, a lot of what I just told you is happening in the unconscious, especially the stuff coming from the id, that primitive part. He thought this was very much below our conscious awareness, and only a little bit of the ego, the things we're trying to sort things out, and that image of who society wants us to be is above. So a lot of it's below. But this is the critical thing I want to talk about here, repressed. And I want to bring up the notion of the censor. And so the idea of the censor is this. Every now and then those psychic pressures cannot be released in appropriate ways. So I talked to you about the guitar, for example, being an appropriate way to release that. But sometimes someone has this psychic conflict, Freud would talk about it, and it's just impossible to release it in these ways, and it starts coming out in other ways. So let me give you a story. So here could be a story. Wow, this microphone is so hot. I'm just going to move it down a little bit. Okay, so here's a potential story. Guy goes to work. He comes home at an unexpected time. Maybe he forgot something at work. Who knows? Here's some sounds that are a little odd in the bedroom. Is blissfully married, by the way. Happily blissfully married. Has been for a long time. Opens the door to the bedroom and for a split moment sees something that, from Freud's opinion, his conscious mind cannot handle, is not ready for. So maybe he sees his wife with another man in the bedroom, but just for a second, and never really aware of it. But something else weird happens. He suddenly suffers a sort of psychological blindness. He just suddenly feels like he's totally blind, slamming into walls, unclear what's going on. Maybe the wife panics, maybe the guy, who knows what goes away. But he acts as though he's completely unaware of what he's just witnessed. And instead what he's preoccupied with is he can't see. He's blind. This person might be brought to Freud. And this would be would be considered a psychosomatic blindness. There's a lot of these conditions, and this is what Freud really worked on. A lot of people had their psychological issues come through in physical ways. And so this person might say, well, I'm blind. A doctor might look at him and say, there's nothing wrong with his optic nerve. There's nothing wrong with the reflexes when I show lights. It looks like his eyes are working perfectly fine. And then Freud might say, okay, something happened that caused this. But it's going to be hard to get to the bottom of. Why? Because this repression, so what he saw, that image is being repressed. I have to start, when I say these things, I always have to say right away, this is Freud's theory that most of us don't believe. Okay? So I don't want you guys thinking I'm telling you the truth here. I'm telling you Freud's theories, and I'll tell you why we might doubt those in a moment. But Freud's theory is this person's conscious mind wasn't ready to handle what they just saw. If they accepted what they just saw, then quite potentially their marriage could be over, their relationship with their children could be altered forever. You know, somebody might have to move out or something like that. Obviously the relationship, and maybe this person they were happy. They liked their life as it was. It was perfectly fine. And they want to be there. And the censor allows them to be there. The censor represses that image from getting into their consciousness in the first place and prevents it from ever getting in there. It's constantly on guard. This person cannot become aware of that, because if they become aware of that, it's going to be really, really difficult for them. So it's trying to protect the consciousness. All of this to bring you to the following point. Most of psychoanalytic theory has that as an assumption. There's some core psychological conflict. It's being held out of the person's awareness by a censor, and the whole purpose of therapy is to try to get around the censor. Think of the censor as like a bouncer that says, you will not have access to this information. You cannot go straight through the censor. You cannot say, oh yes I will, because the censor's too big or too strong. You have to find a way to trick the censor. You have to find a way to get that information in a less direct way. And virtually all of psychoanalytic tradition are different ways of doing that. So some of you may have heard of free association, where you just say the first word that comes to mind when I say X, and do it as quickly as you can. And what the person's trying to get is certain clues about the psychological conflict, and if you make the person respond really quickly, then maybe the censor doesn't have time to figure out what you're trying to get at. You know, maybe you can kind of get some information out. Freud loved hypnosis for a while. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you. Freud liked hypnosis and saw hypnosis as a potential way of getting around the censor. He ultimately rejected that. We could talk about why. But eventually, the approach that he liked the best was dreams. And it was Freud that really brought dreams to the forefront. So he thought, when we're asleep, the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. He thought dreams would show you the unconscious mind. But of course, it's not quite as easy as that. The censor is still there, Freud thought, just not as alert. You know, it's just not sort of as engaged as it is when we're awake and alert. And so what the censor was doing then was, in fact, it's called disfigurement here, but there's the real unconscious thoughts, and we'll talk about what that was called in a moment. But then the claim was what the censor does is disguise those. It takes the real thing that's going on in the unconscious and it presents it in our dreams in a symbolic form. And so you got these dreams that were kind of weird and bizarre in various ways, but everything in the dream was a symbol. Everything in the dream meant something about the underlying unconscious forces. And so if you could interpret those dreams, if you could go from the symbol to that underlying cause, that could be a pathway to get to the unconscious mind and to get to the psychological conflict. Okay? One person asked when I gave this lecture yesterday, if Freud wasn't a scientist, where did he come up with all this stuff? Freud was like a detective and a doctor and a really good writer at the same time. You know, he wrote very well, and he is known for being very attentive to details. So when he interacted with his patients, you know, he really got a lot of details, and he essentially crafted a story. He came up with all these ideas, and of course some of it feels right? We all feel like we have a primitive self. We've seen it ourselves. I would call it the limbic system. I would say when you're angry, you know, when somebody pushes your buttons and kicks in your sympathetic nervous system and you're angry, I would say that's about as close as we come to our id. You know, that is when we will say things that are nasty, intending to hurt somebody else. We will occasionally do things. Some people will actually get aggressive in those situations, etc. And so there's clearly a part of all of us that lives inside of us that is that. And there's also clearly a part of us, we sometimes call it our conscience, that worries about being seen as doing the right thing, as being the right person, as being good to our family, good to our community, all that kind of stuff. That's sort of like the superego, right? So a lot of the stuff that Freud has makes sense to some extent. He's come up with his own terms, his own knowledge, and starts talking about how these things interact Based on what? Data, whatever? No, based on his thoughts. I think this is how it works. And it's largely sort of creative writing. He was also a very good writer. And so the public started eating up Freud. And they started eating up for two reasons. One, he's a really good writer. I recommend you read some Freud. It's fun. His writing style is really interesting. Two, for reasons I talked to you about earlier, he really highlights sex and aggression and the forces of sex and aggression. Why? Again, I told you earlier, he didn't think that's all there was to us, but he thought those are the things you cannot easily satisfy in an open social way. Those are the things that we kind of, pull behind the shades, so to speak. And that, he thought, is why they were often the source of the psychic energy, the psychic problem, because we had to somehow control these desires in various ways. So Freud was saying these things during the Victorian era in Europe, when nobody talked about sex. Nobody talked about sex openly. This is like duels. Oh, you've offended my honor. They're shooting guns at each other for, insulting somebody. They did not talk openly about any of this stuff except Freud. And so people found him just fascinating. He was controversial. He was saying all sorts of things. We could talk about some of the things. Young girls are sexually attracted to their father. Young boys are sexually attracted to their mother. What? Those are the kinds of things Freud was talking about, where people are like, what the heck does he mean by that? And so a lot of people got really fascinated. They especially got fascinated with this, dreams and dream interpretation. So it became a thing. Okay. This is just sort of a highlight. This is just to bring together some of the things I already told you about, but just so we document it in a straightforward way here. The censor protects us from realizing sort of unconscious desires, sex or aggression, but sometimes even being aware, remembering. Again, it can repress things from us. The censor transforms thoughts into harmless dream symbols. Will not disturb the sleep or conscious thoughts. So we're going to talk about those symbols in just a moment. But dreams are meaningful, dreams can be interpreted. And Freud thought it's through the interpretation of dreams that might often be the best way to understand what's going on in somebody's unconscious psyche. Dreams themselves, he thought, were an attempt to satisfy sexual and aggressive impulses that we cannot satisfy when we are awake. I think that's a pretty restrictive notion of dreams. Maybe there's some sex and aggression in our dreams, but I think there's a whole lot more in our dreams that's not sex and aggression. So I think that's a little limiting. But at any rate, those were probably the ones that Freud found the most relevant, the most interesting. And he would always do this sort of split between what's called manifest content and latent content. So what are these two? Manifest content is like if somebody said, what were you just dreaming? And you tell them what your dream was. So let me give you an example. I did this yesterday. I don't remember too many dreams, but I do have dreams for sure, and I do remember, but it seems like all of my dreams fall into really one category that has two variants. The category is frustration. All of my dreams are dreams of frustration. And there's two variants. There's one really weird variant where I'm almost always in China. I'm somewhere else, but almost always in China. I've been there for a while, and it's time to come home. But I'm having a horrible time getting from my hotel to the airport on time. And it starts with things like just packing my bags. It's suddenly like I have 4 wardrobes full of clothes and I have one bag. And I'm trying to figure out how did I get all these clothes here and where am I going to put them in? And then I go to elevators and instead of going down, they're going left and right and all sorts of weird ways. I can barely get to the airport, but every now and then I do get to the airport, but then I can't find my gate. I almost always miss my flight. Sometimes several days in a row I'm in an airport and I wake up and I go, what the heck is this dream? But as I just told it to you, that's the manifest content. That's what I feel like I'm seeing in my mind. That's what I tell you about. The latent content is what it means. It's, what is that unconscious notion? So these things, China, the airport, the trying to pack stuff, Freud would see all these as symbolic in some way. They were representing something, some struggle, I guess, that I face. And he would try to interpret all of those. I'll give you my other funny one, which is sort of the same dream in a different form. I'm just curious if other people experience this. It's really the same thing, except, as you may know, I used to be in a band before the pandemic. I haven't practiced for whatever, but I always look forward to playing out. And my other dreams are, we have this great gig, there's a bunch of people there, and I can't get my equipment to work. Nothing's working, this guitar's not right, strings are breaking, electronics aren't working, blah, 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 and I'm slowly watching the people walk away. And then eventually they all leave, and I'm on stage like, failure. So, again, the source of that energy is some sort of frustrated energy, right? But it comes out in those two different manifest contents. Freud might think they might reflect the same latent content, maybe, but what would that be? Okay, so let's just talk a little bit more through this notion of dream images. So I'm going to show you this now. This is what's called a click on target question, which means I'm just asking you, have you had dreams with any of these themes? We'll talk about what it means if you did. And so with these, you can just touch the ones that you have had, that you've experienced in your dreams. And you can touch up to 9. There's 9 things, so you don't have to touch them all, obviously, and shouldn't if they're not representative of your experience. But tap as many of them as are. And we'll let that roll along for a bit. Okay. I'll just give a few more because it's still coming in strong. Okay, it looks like we're just about there. All right. So this is a heat map, just to show you what are the common themes. And you see really all of these are relatively common themes. So we see them pretty regularly. Falling seems to be especially strong. Taking a test, well, that's for you guys. Let me, by the way, no, I won't go there. Dying, relatively. Infidelity, not so much. Pregnancy, not so much. Probably more a question of your stage of life, where you're at for those two. Being naked, sort of in the middle, etc. What does it mean if you have one of these? Well, you can go online if you want, and you can get an answer. There you go. Theoretically, according to thepleasantdream.com, I guess, this is what those dreams mean. What would Freud think of this? Freud would say this is bullcrap. Okay? Freud did not think there was a generic connection between manifest content and latent content. Dreaming about an airplane doesn't always mean the same thing. Freud thought you really had to know the person. You had to understand the person well and know their life, so you spend hours talking to them and getting to know them, and only through that knowledge of the person could you accurately interpret what the latent content for certain dream symbols mean. So the creator of dream analysis would find this stuff ridiculous when people do this sort of dream analysis where it's, hey, you have these symbols, check out your symbols, find out what they mean. Okay, so some people won't believe in Freud's version of dream analysis. He wouldn't believe in this version of dream analysis, just so you know. But it's out there, and it's fun, etc. But sort of untrustworthy. So, that brings up the question then, well, how do we know if Freud is right about all this? And this is that point I tell you we always get to with Freud, in an intro psych class at least. We don't. Worse yet, we can't. So Freud's stories about how things happen are so complex and contain so many interactions between so many sort of parts of the psyche that there is virtually no data that you could acquire that Freud could not explain in some way. His theory is so powerful, he can explain almost every outcome. And that means you cannot falsify his view. You cannot find any bit of data that shows he's wrong. And so to a scientist, it's not that Freud is bad, it's not that Freud is wrong, it's that Freud is useless, not relevant to science. Because science is about putting theories against each other, and we value theories that can be falsified. If you can't falsify a theory, you can never disprove it. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it just means we don't know what to do with it. Our whole science process is about disproving hypotheses. And if there are no hypotheses that you can make that makes a clear prediction, this should happen or else, if it doesn't, I'm wrong. If you can't ever do that, then your theory is just way too powerful. and it's not irrelevant. Okay, so this is what most scientists think. Now again, let me reiterate, Freud wasn't trying to impress scientists, right? Freud wasn't trying to pass some test of here's my hypothesis, here's how to test it. Freud was trying to come up with an explanation of what he saw, and that was his explanation. Very interesting. So that's kind of where we are, and I want to sort of make this as a right-hand turn in the sense that Freud really got everybody excited about dreams, thinking about what they meant. And yet most of the scientific psychological community did not have any respect per se for Freud's ideas. But that doesn't mean they're not interested in dreams. So that's why we're going to transition a little bit now from Freud to the more scientific side of psychology. Nowadays, we have the ability to study things like dreams in very powerful ways. So we talked about the cognitive revolution. We talked about the fact that part of the cognitive revolution is the idea that while there may be things you can't see directly, like memory or attention or consciousness or dreams, you can't measure them directly, you can sometimes learn about them through the sort of data they leave behind, through the clues they leave that we can measure in other ways. And so here are some of the things you can measure or manipulate. Like, for example, look at the top right there, light, sounds, and sense. We can actually, bring into the sleeping environment stimuli. And then we could, for example, wake the person up and ask them what they were dreaming. When they're dreaming, we could see if there's a link between the stimuli in the environment and the dreaming, etc. We can measure brain activity, of course, with electroencephalography. Wow, I said that weird. But it's basically measuring the electrical activity in the brain through the static. It's just essentially microphones that are listening to the brain as the brain communicates and produces static, but it produces static in certain ways. You've probably seen this in the textbook. I'll show you again real quickly in a moment. But we can also look microphone to record spoken reports. We know, by the way, and let's talk about this really quickly. I'll talk about two cool things about dreams. I'll talk about one now and one in a second. One of them is they fade so quickly. Why do they fade so quickly? Literally, our brain at night has a whole different set of neurotransmitters doing their thing than when the brain is awake and active. And it's almost like a shift change. You see punching out of work now and going home, whatever. It's almost like that happens when your eyes open up and you wake up. The neurotransmitters that were in your brain and were very active at night get swapped out for the ones that are your daytime sort of neurotransmitters, your alert and awake neurotransmitters. As they swap out, you lose that image that was in your mind. So that was being held by your nighttime neurotransmitters. That was sort of being controlled by your nighttime neurotransmitters. But as they leave, so does your dream with it. So you either have to have a pen and paper right there and be a so-called dream journal right beside your bed and ready to write down exactly what you remember, because you're only going to get so much. As you're writing, it's going to be disappearing from you. So you're only going to be able to hold on to so much, and that's what you got. Sometimes you can use like a microphone to maybe get that information out a little quicker. You can just say what your dream report was, so that might be a little quicker. Of course, we can ask for data through questionnaires, and we can have wearables and various other things that can tell us about heart rate, blood pressure, etc. So we can really see what the body is doing. We can get a sense of what's going on in the brain, and we can present stimuli and stuff and see what's going on. So there's the potential, even though it's a private state that a person experiences while they're asleep, there's the potential to do science on this. So let's talk about a little bit of that potential. Of course, it all started, or a big part of it started, with the EEGs, the electroencephalograms. And this is really a good point to just always connect with the role that technology is going to play, because this is a part of psychology that really shows how relevant technology is to our ability to continue learning, which is important for you guys, by the way, because you guys may be able to discover things that we never could because we didn't have the tools. There may be new tools that come around that allow you guys to make major discoveries in psychology. Psychology is young. We got so much to learn. Unlike physics, chemistry, etc., psychology is so young. And that should be exciting to a student if you're interested in psychology, because you could be one of the big players that forms the field. And part of that story will be a question of, harnessing technology, because technology is allowing us to see things that we couldn't see before. And this is an example from the 1960s of that. Okay, so in 1960s, that's when they started the EEG, that's when they started listening to the brain, the static of the brain, and that's when they found this sort of pattern, that as we go through the night, we begin awake, and we see these so-called alpha waves here, which are demarcated by what we call a high frequency. They're really close together, these waves, and a relatively low amplitude. Amplitude is this, you know, how far up and down do they go? So this is this sort of high frequency, low amplitude thing that we see when we're awake. This is the mind very active, processing the world in a very active way. Now, as you go to sleep, this all slows down. First of all, lower amplitude, but also certainly longer wavelength. So the static quiets a little bit, literally, as you start to relax. Then we start to see these so-called spindles kind of come in here. So we see a normal thing, but there's this little weird electrical sound that pops up every now and then. That's demarcating stage 2. That's suggesting you're starting to go into deeper sleep. And then you end up in here with these what we call delta waves. So this is deep sleep. This is when you're really, really asleep. If we wake you up if you wake up to an alarm clock, if you ever have that feeling of waking up to an alarm clock where you're like, oh my God, I can't get out of bed, I am so tired, I just don't want to go anywhere, you were probably in stage 3 or 4. You were probably as far away from being awake as you can be. And so to be suddenly woken up, this is where people sleepwalk as well, by the way. And so to be suddenly woken up, this is why it's dangerous to wake up a sleepwalker. It's not really dangerous. You're not going to cause any real thing. But you could freak them out. You could really confuse them. Because if they're in the kitchen, but in their mind, they're somewhere else totally, and you wake them up, and then suddenly they're sitting there in the kitchen with you, it can be really confusing to them. It can be really like, what the heck is going on? Because they were so far somewhere else. So this is when it's really hard and painful in a way to emerge from this sleep. Now, here's the other second interesting thing we want to talk about. Right at the end of stage 3 or 4, your brain does a cool thing. It releases some neurotransmitters that paralyze your body. Your motor cortex is still doing its thing. It's still sending signals to your body. So if you were dreaming of, say, playing tennis, your motor cortex would still be lighting up almost like it would be if you were playing tennis. It would be very similar, but the signal doesn't, well, the muscles don't operate. So you might be dreaming of doing this, but you're not actually doing that. You're just sleeping with your eyes going crazy. Now, this doesn't happen for everybody. The last thing you want to do is go to some place where you meet significantly other people and take home somebody who this doesn't happen to, because those people act out their dreams. Okay, if for those people for whom the paralysis doesn't work, then if they're playing tennis, their arms are flying around. If they're playing soccer, they're kicking out. If they're in a fight, they're fighting. And if you're beside them, you're getting beat up pretty bad. You know, they're getting beat up, by the way. They beat themselves up pretty bad because they don't know they're right beside a wall of their bed or whatever, and they'll reach out and slam their hand, into that because they're dreaming they're somewhere else. So when it goes wrong, that shows us why it does what it does otherwise. So it prevents us from doing that. And we might jerk a little bit, we might move around a little bit while we're dreaming or sleeping, but we tend to be very still, and that's because we're paralyzed. That's one of the reasons some of those dream themes that we'll talk about come up so much. So you get paralyzed right near the end of this, but before your actual dream state. The dream state itself looks kind of similar to the awake state, just not nearly as dramatic. So we still sort of have these alpha waves, these sort of low amplitude, high frequency, but they're not as high frequency, they're not as much amplitude, but it's similar. It's the most similar to the waking brain, the dreaming brain is. And of course, the critical thing is what we found is we go through this cycle over and over again through the night. We'll see a graph of that again in a second. But after we dream, we go back, not to awake, but we go back to stage 1 or stage 2, and then we go back into deep sleep, and then we dream again. And we go back through that again. And again, this happens repeatedly through the night. And that's why I say you dream multiple times. So, who was it that first found this relation. You know, we say now REM, rapid eye movement, that tells you when you were dreaming. Oh, we'll get to that. Leave you in suspense. But let me ask you this question first and see what you think. Do your dreams ever have the following elements? Do you feel like you were weighed down in some way, like there's a weight on your chest, or you're trying to run but you're slow, or you generally feel sluggish, maybe even paralyzed or barely able to move? Yeah, just go ahead and report, and I'll tell you why I'm asking this while you're reporting. These are common themes, and this is thought to reflect the brain being sort of half aware that you're paralyzed, that there's part of the brain that recognizes, hey, I can't move my body. I don't have this control over my body. And so in our dreams, when we need the control, when we want to run, when we want to do stuff, we sometimes have this feeling like, I can't get my body going. And sometimes that turns into like there's a weight on me, like I'm laying down and I can't get moving. And so we'll think of it as a weight on our chest, but really it's more like my muscles aren't moving. And so we're just stuck there. So we may reinterpret that in different ways, but these things are relatively common. So let's see if there's an endorsement of this. So, you know, it's sort of a mediocre endorsement. So yep, some people say often or very often, few sometimes, and some people that don't really recall. You know, that's really just whether your brain does become sensitive to that. All of our dreams are quite different from one another. So it's really tricky to ever have a, you know, this is true of everybody kind of thing. But that's why that comes through. Okay, so this is where I wanted to take you for a moment here and just say, this dude, William Dement, he's the one that really started dream research from a scientific perspective. He's the one that found REM sleep, but he also did the following things. So I'm using this example to kind of start you combining, I guess, chapter 2, the scientific method, and you know, ultimately the pinnacle of that's experiments. Can you do experiments of some sort with this challenge of understanding dreams? How can you kind of experimentally study dreams? He didn't quite follow through exactly as I hoped he would, but he did something really, really cool. So first of all, let's start over here and just make sure, over here, and just make sure everyone's comfortable, you know, with this. So I think you've seen this figure a few times before, but this is what I walked you through just a second ago. You start the night awake, but then you go down to stage 1, you go all the way down to deep sleep, and then once you're in deep sleep, you kind of scoot back to stage 1 or 2. You go to REM sleep at the end of that, and then you start again around stage 1 or 2, and you go back down to deep sleep. And then you come back up to REM, and you go back to deep, and you go back to REM, back to deep, etc. And you do this several times during the night. Notice that the REM periods get longer and longer. He noticed that. He also would wake people up in these periods, and he noticed that's when they always report a dream, when they're in this REM state. And so then he did this interesting study. 8 men, sort of middle-aged men. First of all, he recorded their baseline. He just said, go ahead and sleep all you want. And he found out that they slept about 7 hours per night, and they spent about 20% of that, a fifth of their time, dreaming. So, you know, it's a lot of time we spend dreaming. So then he did the following, and this is the really cool thing, dream deprivation. Had to be one of the most annoying experiments to be in. You basically, this is how it would work. You're sleeping, you go down into deep sleep, you come back, you come up, you're just entering a dream and someone wakes you up. What's going on? Oh, nothing, go back to sleep. Okay, you go back to sleep, but when that happens, you don't go back to dreaming. You start over again. So you go to stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, you come back up, you're just about to dream and someone wakes you up. Hey, wake up, what? Nothing, go back to sleep. And they keep doing this to you. So they wake you up just as you're about to dream. What that can result in is you can get a full night's sleep, 7 hours asleep, but none of that dreaming. We can basically remove dreams from your sleep. And that can, you know, basically allow us to ask, well, what are they for? What happens if you do that? By the way, this is sometimes considered very unethical research now because they had no idea what would happen. This guy didn't know what would happen. He had no idea how important dreams were or were not. And so it could have been something really bad. It kind of was something really bad, in a way. The side effects of dream deprivation have been researched before. So a study in the 60s, that's who they're talking about in this one, uncovered that subjects who were selectively deprived of REM sleep experienced weight gain, increased irritability, difficulty concentrating, and anxiety. That's a nice way to say they were starting to go insane. They were losing it. If you don't get to dream, you start really losing it. You get very on edge, you get very uncomfortable, your sympathetic nervous system is engaged, that's that anxiety, very irritable, nasty with other people. You start falling apart. You know, it's really, really difficult. These dreams are doing something. So, you know, that's one thing that study shows. What are they doing? Why do we need it that way? Well, that's something maybe some of you guys will discover. We don't know yet, but we certainly know that this dream deprivation is important, that maybe something is going on during dreaming that is biologically really important to us at some level, because, again, we fall apart when we don't get it. So an interesting example of how you can start to get at what dreams are for. Obviously, a lot more work to do here. I also just want to give you a sense, and we're just about done here, but just I want to give you a sense of alternate theories. So I told you about Freud's theory. There's in fact a few theories of dreams that are out there. This is the theory with the best scientific support. And I have to tell you, compared to Freud's nice juicy theory, it's really boring. So this is how the activation synthesis theory goes. It's associated generally with a guy named Alan Hobson, as you see there. And Alan Hobson was a physiologist. He's interested in brain physiology, and he put forward this very boring physiological theory of the mind. Part of it you know already. So in my last lecture, I spent a lot of time talking about how the brain likes to make sense of things by making them like stuff it's experienced before, and how it does that with sensation and perception, how it does that with memory, how it does that with language. Well, the claim is it does it with dreams as well. But the data that it has to work with is random. So here's the claim, that our brains, while we're asleep, there's still electrical signals being passed around, and just randomly, as they're being passed around, certain concepts could become active in our mind. Okay, for no good reason, it's just random activation, but maybe suddenly camel becomes active, maybe Jamaica becomes active, maybe my friend Mike becomes active, and maybe drums become active. And so suddenly I'm having some dream where me and Mike are in Jamaica or going to Jamaica playing drums when a camel comes and kicks us in the butt. I don't know. So the idea is the brain is getting all this random stuff, and it tries to create a sensical story out of it. That the sense-making part is still trying to do its thing, but it's awful hard to make sense of random stuff that comes up. And so the connections it makes, the stories that it kind of tells us, what we perceive in our mind are these bizarre, odd stories where things can change really quickly from one place to another. You know, so I'm in Jamaica one moment, and then next I'm somewhere else totally in my dream. Why? Well, theoretically, because that part of the brain that was active, the Jamaica part, suddenly is no longer active, some other thing is active, and so I kind of flow along with this random activation, continually trying to make a story out of it. Not as exciting as sexual and aggressive impulses coming out in symbolic form that you can, you know, de-interpret and figure out, etc. But it makes predictions. The predictions are trickier because we get very neurophysiological. I'm not even going to keep this up for very long, other to say that when we are testing predictions now, there are lots of tools we have and lots of approaches where we can kind of get at things. And I'm just going to give you a taste of two real quick here. I did a quick search, and by the way, if you find this interesting, go to Google Scholar, type in dreams, and if you want, activation synthesis model or dreams, Freud, whatever, you can find all sorts of research. After that peer scholar activity you've done, hopefully you're more comfortable interacting with primary research. Go find articles you find cool and start interacting with them. It's a great way to develop your sort of scientific chops. So here's a couple that I just found when I looked for dreams and activation synthesis model. So here, what do we have? 104 dreams. So they had people record their dreams. 14 different adults recorded their dreams, and their dreams were quantified. And they categorized certain things: movement, sensation, affect, that's sort of emotionality, dream bizarreness, dream lucidity. How sort of deep did they feel they were? How sort of almost awake did they feel? It turns out that if we look at brain activity, according to Hobson's notions, we should see certain brain activity result in certain sorts of dreams. So activity in the motor cortex, for example, should be related to movement happening in the dreams. If you woke the person up, they should report movement, etc. And that's sort of what we see. If you look at which parts of the brain are active as a person is dreaming, and then you wake them up and you ask them their dreams correspond very closely to what's going on in the brain. Even if it's sort of this random stuff. So that seems to fit with the activation synthesis. Does it not fit with Freud? Well, everything fits with Freud, right? Freud would say maybe those things are psychologically relevant and you are thinking about them and they are lighting up in your brain because you're thinking about them and then they go in your dreams, but they have symbolic value. You know, Freud would take that next step. Here's another one about dream bizarreness. So when we have these really weird things happening in our dreams, dream journal data suggests that the bizarre features of dreams can be divided into these 3 categories. So they're actually, looking at dream stories and categorizing them in certain ways, and that this dream bizarreness appears to be a result of some state-dependent cognitive process rooted in REM sleep neurophysiology. Wow, really kind of boring. But all of that to say, when they look at the neurophysiology going on in the brain, again, it seems to predict what we're going to see in people's dreams. So I just present these as examples of relatively recent studies. I mean, that one's 1987, this is 1981, so they're not that recent. But a lot of people are studying dreams and trying to get to the bottom of it. And there are a lot of theories, and you can make predictions, and you can test predictions. And so even though it's a huge challenge for psychology and for science, we're up for it. And if it's a cool thing, why not study it? Why not try to understand it? And so, yeah. So really, I think that's the sort of story. I just wanted to give you this sense of where we are with research with dreams, but I like leaving it kind of hanging where it is because you probably feel dissatisfied. Like, that's all we know about dreams? Sort of. Not much more. But again, turn that dissatisfaction into opportunity. If you like dreams, you'll hear that story about just about anything. If you're interested in prejudice and why prejudice happens, and you go to the research, what you'll probably find is, well, we know some of the story. We have a little bit of the story, but there's a lot of the story we don't know. That can be frustrating if you want to hear the whole story, but it can be exciting if you want to write the story. If you want to say, hey, I want to be part of finding out the rest of this story. There's a lot of opportunity in psychology. Dreams are just one example of that. So I think that's one of the really cool things about psychology.